Is Daniel here? Daniel, come on up. Now, Daniel, again, I had a couple topic choices sort of for him. And when he actually proposed what he wanted to do, I more or less just dropped everything I was thinking and said, oh yeah, that just sounds sweet. Again, you're familiar, having read the website. We're going to hear, some good stuff about Second Temple Judaism again. Enoch, Watchers, Nephilim, calendar, all that sort of good stuff. Lots of goodness there. Daniel, I want to get your degree right here. As an MA from Yale and PhD from Southeastern. And how close are you to finishing the other one? He's working on a second PhD in early Judaism. You graduate next year? Sweet. Okay, that's going to be from the University of Durham, which Archie had gone there as well. So without any further delay, please take over.
Great. Well, I'm glad to be here. Thank you, Mike, for inviting me. I think I had met Mike one time before this. He says we had met at an SBL, which I imagine is true, Society of Biblical Literature, which is a big nerd conference every year in November. And I have a student, David Burnett, who's been on the podcast several times, and he was really excited about Mike's work, and I think he's the one that probably put us in touch. So I'd also like to thank David Burnett. I don't know if he's watching the live stream or not. He's up doing a PhD at Marquette in Biblical Studies. My wife was a little bit concerned when I told her I was going to a naked Bible conference. But I assured her that everybody would be wearing clothes. I can't speak for those watching the live stream, of course, but anyway, I tried to come up with as juicy a title as I could for my presentation. Let me see if it comes out. Hey, there it is. Flood, Fire, and Festival. How the Nephilim and Noah's flood unlocked the mystery of Yom Kippur and the final judgment. I almost sold this as a script to the History Channel, but they wanted aliens in it too, so couldn't figure out how to work them into it. I know it's been a long day, and I'm the last to present, and your brains probably feel like they're turning to mush and everything. So I thought maybe we could start with a game. Ready for a game? Okay, well, that didn't take long. It's not funny after this slide, okay? So, but I think I Googled Jesus sermon funny, and that's the first picture that came up. So I can't take credit for that picture, but I think that would be a nice Bible version, wouldn't it, to have to have pictures of all the famous biblical scenes, but with these Google eyes, I guess you'd call them. I'm not sure. Well, I got interested in this topic probably 12, 13 years ago when I was doing my PhD program, and I wrote on the flood narrative in the Old Testament in Genesis 7 to 9. And I began seeing ways in the Old Testament that the flood was used as a model for the final judgment. Okay, and so I began exploring that, and then I found that the literature between the Testaments, intertestamental literature, the literature of the Second Temple period, kind of elaborated on that, and I found it in the New Testament all over the place. So I wanted to start with Matthew 24, right in the New Testament, where Jesus makes a direct connection between the flood and the final judgment when the Son of Man comes back. So Jesus says in Matthew 24, probably a saying that's very familiar to everyone. It's also in Luke's gospel. As the days of Noah were. He talks about this time around the flood, right? So probably that time period leading up to the flood, the 120 years, as Genesis describes it. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. So he draws this direct parallel. In those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day Noah entered the ark, and they knew nothing until the flood came and swept them all away. So too will be the coming of the Son of Man. I think in Luke's version, it actually talks about, and Matthew has a saying to this effect too, that when the coming of the Son of Man happens, it will be like the flood. One will be taken and another will be left behind. And several of you might be, or probably all of you are familiar with the Left Behind series of novels about the end times. I think in that series, being left behind is bad, but in Jesus' saying being left behind is probably good because the others are swept away in judgment. So I like to tell my students, I want to be left behind, right? That's not a bad thing. But you can see already here, Jesus has drawn this direct parallel between the flood and the final judgment. The flood is kind of a model for what the final judgment will be. It happens other places in the New Testament as well. 2 Peter, passage that's near and dear to everyone's heart here, I think. The author says, if God did not spare the angels when they sinned, the sons of God, almost certainly of Genesis 6, but he cast them into Tartarus, there's a word straight from Greek myth, and he committed them to chains of deepest darkness. We'll see chains come up later in the presentation, this idea that it wasn't just he tossed them in a hole, right? But he's actually chained them up with, I guess, pretty strong chains. And they are going to be kept there until the judgment. And he did not spare the ancient world, even though he saved Noah. So immediately we find out we're in that context of the flood, right? He saved Noah, a herald of righteousness, along with 7 others, when he brought a flood on a world of the ungodly. He says, if that's the case, right, then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trial. He did save Noah. And to keep the unrighteous under punishment until the day of judgment. Okay, he's got things under control. I find especially interesting here in verse 10, those who are kept under punishment are those who indulge their flesh in depraved lust. That's a description, I think, or at least an allusion to those watchers, right, who lusted after human women. They crossed that boundary. And you'll see that language quite a bit of indulging the flesh or boundary crossing lust when it comes to the watchers. And of course, they despise authority. You're all familiar with the story of the watchers, how they make a pact to basically rebel against the Most High God. So I find it interesting that Peter also draws that connection between the flood and the judgment of those angels, and he ties it right to final judgment. Okay, and he assures his audience of final judgment on the basis of the flood. Again in 2 Peter, a similar kind of statement. In the last days, scoffers will come, scoffing and indulging their own lusts, and saying, where's the promise of his coming? When is Jesus coming back? Ever since our ancestors died, everything continues like it was. The world keeps going on. They deliberately ignore this fact that by the word of God, heavens existed long ago, and an earth was formed out of water and by means of water. Okay? If you read Genesis, the land is just covered with water, and God sends his wind to blow back the water and reveal the dry land. Peter alludes to that. And then he ties it directly to the flood. The flood reversed that original creation. It covered the land with water again, and everything became a watery chaos, through which the world of that time was deluged with water and perished. By the same word, the present heavens and earth have been reserved for fire, being kept until the day of judgment and destruction of the godless. So Peter talks about a judgment on the former world through water and a judgment on the present world, which he says will come through fire. Now, what's interesting is when you look back at ancient texts, you find this tradition of 2 judgments, one by water, one by fire, flood and fire, and it pops up all over the place. Now, I've only included one of these texts in my presentation, but you can find it all over the place. This one's an interesting one from Josephus, the great first century Jewish historian. Pretty much everything we know about first century Judaism we get from Josephus. I mean, if we didn't have Josephus, we'd just all be groping around in the dark. Okay? If you ever go to Israel, you'll get an Israeli tour guide, and he pretty much just tells you what Josephus wrote the whole time you're in Israel. Because if we didn't know what Josephus tells us, we really wouldn't know much at all about that time period around the time of Jesus. Anyway, this is what Josephus tells us about that once by flood, once by fire tradition regarding the final judgment. Josephus says, or the British guy that translates him says, I will only endeavor to narrate the story of the progeny of Seth. That means his offspring. They discovered the science of the heavenly bodies. That's often attributed to Enoch. And their orderly array, that is probably calendar. Okay. Adam had predicted a destruction of the universe. This is a prophecy that's attributed to Adam. I don't know that we have any texts predating Josephus that actually talk about Adam prophesying the final judgment. I know we have texts after that where he gets prophecies. But Josephus says this tradition tells us that Adam had predicted a destruction of the universe, at one time by violent fire, and at another by a mighty deluge of water. So 2 judgments or universal destructions, one by flood, one by fire. And Adam passes this on to Seth, and Seth passes it on to his offspring, and they come up with an ingenious plan. To prevent their discoveries from being lost to mankind and perishing before they became known, they built 2 pillars, one of brick and the other of stone. Why would you do it of 2 different materials? Well, they know one destruction is going to be by fire, right? The brick will survive that, and the stone, I guess, will survive the water judgment. He says that way, if the pillar of brick disappeared in the deluge, that of stone would remain to teach men what was engraved on it, and to inform them that they had also erected one, that they had also erected one of brick. So if the water comes, right, you'll still have one of the pillars standing that will preserve all of this information. It's a pretty interesting idea, I think. And we find this tradition all over the place in the ancient world, this 2 pillars tradition. Josephus actually says you can go see it today in the land of Ceres. He probably knows of some pillar with an inscription on it that nobody can read, and so he figures that's the one they set up back then, right? Makes sense. So this tradition of judgment by flood and judgment by fire. Now, I think when you look at some of the aspects of the flood in the Genesis narrative, you can see why it was so obviously taken as a model for the final judgment. It comes on all flesh, Genesis tells us. It doesn't destroy everyone. There's a remnant of the faithful who are saved and preserved through this judgment. Genesis says that the reason the flood comes is because of corruption and violence, and we're going to see that come up in other texts, so remember that. I find it interesting that after the flood, we have all of these notes that remind us of the original creation. The story of the flood waters receding reminds us of the original creation account, where the earth is uncovered, basically, from the water. But the wind uncovers the dry land. What's the first thing Noah is told when he comes out of the ark? Be fruitful and multiply. Well, that's supposed to remind you of Adam, right? Adam and Eve. I put up their dietary commandments. Noah and his offspring are told not to eat flesh with the blood in it. That might give you the idea that that was a problem before the flood. Okay. Adam and Eve were also given dietary commandments, if you remember, placed in the garden and told what to eat and what not to eat. And then the first thing that Noah does is he plants a vineyard, and he gets drunk and naked. And that sounds a lot like what happens to Adam, right? He's in this garden planted by God. He ends up eating fruit and finding out he's naked. You ever notice that the way Mike pronounces naked is different from the way Trey pronounces it? Yeah. Trey has the Texan pronunciation, doesn't he? Naked. And you don't realize this, that there's actually 2 quite different meanings for that. If you would study the Hebrew root of these words, you would understand that. I like to tell my students, naked is what Adam and Eve were before they ate. Naked is after, right? Then they were naked, okay? That's not good, naked, all right? One thing that happens when Noah emerges from the ark is that God makes a covenant with him. And we're going to see that come up in some of the prophets, where they talk about the new covenant that God's going to make with his people after some type of judgment, destruction event. Okay? Why was it that the flood became a model of this final judgment? I think it's kind of interesting. If you read the Genesis account, God says, I'm never going to destroy the world again through water, right? Well, if you're an attentive ancient reader, you're thinking, no, wait, why didn't he just say never again, period? Why through water, right? And so some of them, I think, began thinking, well, if it's not through water, it must be through the only other thing that could really destroy the world, which would be fire. There's also this passage in Genesis 8 that says, as long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, the seasons, right, day and night will not cease. you kind of get the feeling that maybe that envisions a time when this wouldn't hold, right? If everything goes up in a fiery conflagration, then presumably the seasons would also be changed. And so there are these hints in the Genesis narrative that might be pushing you to think about final judgment. And sure enough, ancient readers followed that. All right, I'm not going to spend much time on this, but a couple passages in the prophets, especially Isaiah, that draw out this connection between the flood and the final judgment. And what I want you to see is that Isaiah seems to be adding in some information, okay, that I think an ancient reader reading between the lines of Genesis 6 through 9 might also add in. Okay, this is from the so-called Isaianic apocalypse, the little apocalypse in Isaiah. It's a kind of a distinct section there in 24 to 27. And Isaiah pictures this coming judgment on the evil city, the city of chaos, quite possibly Babylon. He says the earth or the land is corrupted. That's the same language used in Genesis. The earth was corrupted, okay, through people's violence. They transgressed laws, violated statutes, broke the everlasting covenant. That term is only used back in Genesis 8, that everlasting covenant that God makes. Okay, and Isaiah says they broke it. They violated it, presumably. So a curse devours the earth. Those who live in it are held guilty. After Noah comes out of the ark, God says, I'm never going to curse the earth again. So that's also an element that's in that flood narrative. Look at how Isaiah describes this final judgment that's coming. The windows of heaven are opened. That's language straight from the flood narrative, that God opens those storehouses above the dome where all the water above is kept, and he just lets it pour down. The earth is burst asunder. This is also from Genesis, the flood narrative in Genesis. The waters below that start bursting up through the ground. The earth is shaken violently. Look at Isaiah 26. What are God's people supposed to do in the midst of this judgment, or to prep for it? See if this reminds you of anything. Verse 20, come, my people, enter your chambers. Remember how Noah built an ark that had many different rooms in it? And shut your doors behind you. This is exactly what happens in the flood narrative. Noah goes to the ark, God shuts the door behind him. Because the Lord comes out of his place to punish the inhabitants of the earth for their iniquity, the earth will disclose the blood shed on it. That's the same language used in Genesis in the flood narrative, that the earth is corrupted because of all the bloodshed. Okay? Isaiah 27 mentions a vineyard, kind of like the one that Noah planted. Isaiah says, after this judgment has passed, God is going to plant a vineyard. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that he's drawing on the flood, that flood story, right? And then we get really interesting and mysterious in Isaiah 24. It's always interesting to me when you get a scholarly commentary and you're reading through it and you're really wanting them to give you some good information, There are a lot of commentaries on Isaiah 24 that barely even deal with this. It's like they're not interested in it at all. And I just find it the most fascinating thing possible. Look at Isaiah 24 there. On that day, this day of judgment, the Lord will punish the host of heaven in heaven, and on earth the kings of the earth. They will be gathered together like prisoners in a pit. They'll be gathered together like prisoners in a pit. They'll be shut up in a prison, and after many days they'll be punished. Now, this could just be reflecting ancient royal practice, that when you had an enemy of the state, you kind of kept him in holding for a while and then had the trial and punished him. Okay? But I think ancient readers tied this passage together with the flood narrative, and they came up with something that was pretty interesting. So we'll see that in the traditions about Enoch and the traditions of the book of Jubilees. Okay, so the basic point is that the prophets show us how the flood was read as a model for the future judgment, and they kind of extrapolated from that to come up with all kinds of other information about the final judgment and the covenant that would follow, the blessings that would follow in God's people. Here's another one from Isaiah. This is where he actually mentions the days of Noah. Remember, Israel has just experienced exile when this section of Isaiah is written. You can see a reference to the exile in verse 8, in overflowing wrath. Why would you call it overflowing? Sound like a flood, kind of? In overflowing wrath for a moment I hid my face from you. but with everlasting love I will have compassion on you. I'm going to bring you back from exile. This is like the days of Noah to me. This exile that you're undergoing, it's like the days of Noah, right? It's almost a total destruction of Israel. But I didn't let it end there, right? I brought a new covenant out of it. I saved a remnant out of it. And I'm going to do the same thing with the exile. And so Isaiah 54 makes that connection as well, explicitly, right? This is like the days of Noah, this judgment that you've undergone. What's going to happen when I bring you out of it? I'll make a covenant of peace. That's down there in verse 10. Just a few other prophets that use flood language. Find it interesting, especially in Daniel 9 there, that this end time scenario, that the end comes with a flood. It's interesting language to use there. Okay, let's move into some of the Second Temple texts. And we'll tie the Day of Atonement into it. Just a little background information on Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is a later term for the Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement was an annual festival, but it's not festive, right? It's actually a fast, so you're not supposed to eat. And it's a time of mourning or self-debasement, okay, is the term that's used, self-affliction. So it wouldn't be like a festival like the Festival of Booths where you've just had the grape harvest and, it's going to be quite a party, right, for 7 days, and then you'll stretch it to an 8th day. This is a time of mourning, a time of forgiveness of sins. It's a fast day. Our key text about it in the Old Testament is Leviticus 16. We really don't have that much information on this festival. I mean, just a challenge sometime, I've done this with students before. Read Leviticus 16 and try to follow the instructions. Imagine that you're a priest. Don't actually kill any animals, okay? But think about how you would actually go about following the instructions. It's quite convoluted. It's not a script. You really wouldn't be able to do the Day of Atonement if all you had was Leviticus 16. Okay. What I'm saying is we don't have that much information about it, really. It's kind of shrouded in mystery in the Old Testament. And I think we'll see that Jews in the time of Jesus came up with several different explanations of what was going on the Day of Atonement. But a couple rituals that you need to be aware of for our purposes. On the Day of Atonement, it was the only day of the year that the high priest, and only the high priest could do this, could enter into the most inside part of the tabernacle or the temple, okay, the Holy of Holies. That's idiom for the holiest place, right? Where the Ark of the Covenant was. This is the only day he can go in there. Now, he goes in there 4 or 5 times on the Day of Atonement to carry out certain rituals. Another ritual that Leviticus 16 tells us about is that 2 goats are brought forward and presented before the Lord, and you take lots, almost like rolling dice, and you cast them or place them or put them on the 2 goats. Okay? One goat is described as a goat for Yahweh, and it's killed and its blood is taken into the Holy of Holies as a sin offering. Okay? It doesn't tell us this in Leviticus 16, but later rabbinic texts say that was the one on the priest's right hand. Okay? That one goes to the Lord as a sacrifice. The other goat is described as a goat for Azazel, or you'll find it translated as a scapegoat. This one's not killed in Leviticus 16. Okay? The priest lays his hands on it and confesses over it the sins of Israel. Then that goat is taken out to the wilderness. Okay. That's where Leviticus 16 stops. It's taken out into the wilderness. But, is that all? What if the goat comes back, right? That would be bad, wouldn't it? Next day after the Day of Atonement. Hey, isn't that the goat that we sent out yesterday? I wonder what that means. By the time of Jesus, the rabbis and other texts, a lot of different texts, all witness to the fact that the goat was taken out, and we're told that he was pushed off a cliff. Okay, so I invented that word, decliffing. That's not a real word. And we're told that he was pushed onto down into a pit that was full of jagged rocks. Okay, and so he dies. All right. Another element that we get in the Second Temple period, another added detail, and it just makes sense if you were actually going to perform the Day of Atonement ritual is that you'd want to identify the goat that was going to be taken out to the wilderness in some way. And so the rabbis tell us that the high priest would take a scarlet, a red colored scarf or cord, rope, and tie it around the goat that was going to be taken out into the wilderness. Okay? That's important. Don't forget that detail. It's all going to come up in these texts we're going to look at. So I think the important thing is to realize that if you were a Jew around the time of Jesus, you would have known a lot more about the Day of Atonement than Leviticus 16 tells you. Okay, you would have known a lot of traditions and rituals, and you would have attributed a significance to the Day of Atonement that might not be right there on the surface in Leviticus 16. Okay, but just some of the key points there about Yom Kippur. Here's where it gets really interesting. I think y'all are all familiar with the book of First Enoch, a composite book. The first section of it, the Book of the Watchers. Archie talked about this quite a bit today, so that was a great introduction, I think, and he's the expert on it, so if you have questions, we'll just direct them all to him, okay? First Enoch is a difficult book because it's obviously composite, and it was compiled over a long period of time at different dates, different sections. We're also dealing with several different languages in play here, okay? Ethiopic, that's not an easy language, okay? And Aramaic, okay? Well, here's what this book, the Book of the Watchers, the first 36 chapters of First Enoch, some of the information that it tells us reminds me and other scholars a lot of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And what's so interesting is that it's placed in the context of Noah and the flood, or that generation right before the flood, okay? You've already heard some of this today. The Book of the Watchers tells about how the sons of heaven, the sons of God from Genesis 6, made an incursion to earth. They come down to earth, they take human wives, they beget giants. These giants oppress and kill human beings, they drink blood, and this corrupts the earth. What this is doing is filling in the blanks in Genesis 6. Okay? How did the earth get corrupted, and what does it mean when it was corrupted with bloodshed in Genesis 6, and Genesis 7, and Genesis 8? Well, what it means is these giants were eating the blood, drinking the blood of human beings, right? Cannibalism, and thus corrupted the earth. In the Book of the Watchers, chapter 8, the leader of the Watchers, remember I said we're dealing with several different languages here, okay? As best we can tell, it was one of the leaders of the Watchers was named Asael, okay? But we have a lot of texts, some of the Qumran texts, the Ethiopic texts of First Enoch, identify him as Azazel, which is the same word used in Leviticus 16 for the scapegoat or the one to whom the scapegoat is taken. Okay? So that's a pretty clear connection between this section of First Enoch and the Watchers and the ritual of Yom Kippur, the festival of Yom Kippur. Scholars have really been puzzled by this and have come up with several different explanations for it. So we'll look at a couple of those in just a little bit. When the Watchers come down, they of course they mate with human women and produce these offspring, but they're also transmitters of information. Okay, they teach forbidden knowledge. And Azazel specifically it's said that he taught humans how to make weapons. Why would you want to make weapons? War. Okay, so he's provoking them to warfare. He also opened up a cosmetology store, a cosmetology school, probably. It says that he taught humans to make jewelry and cosmetics, and that this is what caused the sons of God to get so turned on, right? Whoa, these human women with their jewelry and their cosmetics, we can't take it, right? But remember those details, okay? He teaches them how to make weapons, and it's strange, but again, you have to think like an ancient person, I think, to appreciate it. Okay, so the Watchers corrupt everything, and the 4 archangels come to the Lord because they've heard the cry of the people on earth who are being oppressed, and they say, Lord, you've got to do something, okay? And so the Lord responds, and he gives 4 different tasks, one to each archangel. Okay, so I've outlined these a little bit here. The 4 archangels here, Michael, Sariel, Raphael, Gabriel. I do find it interesting that already you have a little bit of Yom Kippur language here in the sense that they're going up into the heavenly throne room or the Holy of Holies, and they're interceding for the people. Here's what the Lord does. First, he sends Sariel to warn Noah of the coming flood. So he says, go tell Noah to start prepping for the flood. Build the ark. The flood is coming. Right? This is how he's ultimately going to solve the problem, is by wiping the slate clean. To Raphael, he says, go, Raphael, and bind Asael head and foot and cast him into the darkness. Go out to the wilderness and make an opening in the wilderness. Sound like the scapegoat? Yeah. Make an opening in the wilderness that is in Dudael. What is Dudael? Okay. Again, we have to bring in other texts. In the rabbinic tradition, we're told that the place they would take the scapegoat was called the house of duty, Beit HaDudi, all right, in Hebrew. It doesn't sound so elegant when you say it in English. And it seems to be a reference to a place where there's jagged rocks, okay? This uninhabited part of the wilderness where there's jagged rocks that you could throw a goat on and it's not going to come back from it, right? More Yom Kippur language here. Throw Azazel there, lay beneath him sharp and jagged stones, cover him with darkness, and it's not going to kill him. He's actually going to be imprisoned there. Let him dwell there for an exceedingly long time. And on the day of the great judgment, after this long time, he will be led away to the burning conflagration, this judgment by fire. And then he says, and over Azazel, write all the sins. Now, that's exactly what happens in Leviticus 16, is that the sins of the people of Israel are placed on the scapegoat and taken out into the wilderness. That's how the sin is cleansed. Okay, so it seems like what we have here in 1st Enoch is providing some type of rationale for Yom Kippur. What the author seems to be saying is, you know how you do all this stuff on Yom Kippur? Well, here's why. It's actually reenacting this judgment that happened prior to the flood of the Watchers who rebelled against God. The judgment continues. Michael gets a task. Go bind Shemihaza. He's another angelic leader, and others with them. Bind them for 70 generations in the valleys of the earth until the day of their judgment and consummation. Then they will be led away to the fiery abyss. Okay. By the way, next time you're reading Luke's gospel, don't skip over that genealogy in chapter 3. Count the number of generations in Luke 3. Count from Adam to Jesus, or Enoch to Jesus. From Adam to Jesus will be 77 generations. From Enoch, who's the seventh from Adam, it's 70 generations. And a scholar named Richard Balcom has argued that Luke does that intentionally. He tells you 70 generations from Enoch to Jesus because he's directly tying into this expectation. Okay. That's just a side note. Sorry, I don't want to get off on a tangent like that, but there's a whole lot going on here, I think. The final thing that's given to these archangels, the final instruction, is to cleanse the earth with the flood. Cleanse it with the... Well, cleansing is what happens on Yom Kippur. That language of cleansing is used in Leviticus 16. And in fact, what happens when the scapegoat is taken out is that 3 things are said to be cleansed. It's 3 terms for sin: impurity, rebellion, lawlessness. There are different ways to translate these terms. And it's exactly the same language that's used in 1st Enoch. So more indications, I think, that 1st Enoch is drawing on the Yom Kippur ritual and trying to provide a historical or mythological basis for it. Okay. If you heard Bill's presentation earlier, he talked about how the festivals began to get tied to historical events, right, in Israel's tradition. And I think what you're seeing here is one more step, where Yom Kippur, what is that commemorating? 1st Enoch says it's commemorating the judgment of the Watchers prior to the flood. Okay, so kind of a rationale for the Yom Kippur ritual. Jubilees also tells the story in a much briefer form. He's probably aware of the book of Enoch, or the book of the Watchers. He might also have other traditions at his disposal that we don't have in text, because he has a slightly different take on the story. But you can see the basic outline is the same. The Watchers come down, these angels, they take human wives, they have giant babies, everything is corrupted. Look at the second text there. Against his angels, now we're going to have the judgment narrated the same way it was in 1 Enoch. Against his angels whom he had sent to the earth, he was very angry. And he told us, this is an angel narrating this, to bind them in the depths of the earth. And he said, my spirit will not dwell upon man forever. That's straight from Genesis. That's a direct quote. But he's explaining it as these watchers, these angelic spirits, have something of the divine spirit, it seems. And they've mixed it with flesh, and we're not going to let this happen. They'll have 110 or 120 years of life, and then we'll wipe them out. Okay? Kind of an interesting explanation, I think, there of Genesis 6:3, I believe it is. So subsequently, they were bound in the depths of the earth forever until the day of great judgment. Now, that's a very compressed version of 1 Enoch's story. You have to read the next section in Jubilees to get the point, I think. Immediately after he tells this story of the watchers and the judgment that comes on them, now remember, we're back in Jubilees, we're back narrating the time of Noah, right? We've not had the Levitical law given or any of the festivals. Immediately, what's the topic that he brings up? The Day of Atonement. Why, if you're the author of Jubilees, would you go from talking about Noah's flood and the judgment of the watchers to the Day of Atonement? Look at this. And just a few verses later, he says, for the children of Israel, it's been written and ordained, if they return to him in righteousness, he will forgive all of their sins and pardon all of their transgressions. He will have mercy on all who return from their error once each year. A very clear, a reference to the Day of Atonement. And it's right in the middle of this flood narrative. He just throws this reference to the Day of Atonement in there in the middle of the flood narrative. You'd be surprised how many scholars miss the connection and don't think that the flood and Yom Kippur are connected at all. I also find it interesting that the first thing Noah does in the book of Jubilees after he gets out of the ark is he offers a goat as a sacrifice. And it says he makes atonement for the land. That could be a reference to the Day of Atonement. That's not the way Jubilees portrays it, but many scholars have argued that it's a precursor to the Day of Atonement sacrifice. So we've got Enoch tying the flood and the judgment of the watchers to Yom Kippur. We've got the book of Jubilees doing the same thing in a pretty surprising juxtaposition. When I look at the New Testament with that in my mind, I start to see places where the final judgment, as Jesus describes it, also has some echoes of Yom Kippur and the ritual there. Look at Matthew 25. You're familiar with the parable of the sheep and the goats. Goats, right? Okay. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he'll separate people one from another like a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He'll put the sheep at his right hand. The casting of lots, the one on the right hand goes to Yahweh, the one on the left hand as a scapegoat or to Azazel. The goats go to the left, the sheep go to the right. Oh, it's pretty hard to distinguish sheep from goats. And the two goats on Yom Kippur were supposed to be identical in appearance, insofar as possible. Then he will say to those at his left hand, depart from me, you cursed ones, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. Why did I highlight cursed? One other thing that Leviticus doesn't tell us, that all of these Second Temple texts do tell us, is that on the Day of Atonement, as they were driving the scapegoat out, they would beat it and curse it. Get on out of here, you stinking scapegoat. Right? I don't know what they said. But they cursed the scapegoat, right? And I find it interesting that we have this idea of, at the final judgment, the goats on the left hand depart, they're sent out into this eternal fire, prepared for the devil and his angels. You could draw a direct line from that to 1 Enoch, I think. The idea that this end-time fiery judgment was actually originally designed for those watchers who have been held imprisoned awaiting that judgment, right? So I've drawn out a couple of the Yom Kippur elements there, but I think we've covered most of them. I do want to point you to the Mishnaic passage there. In Mishnah Rosh Hashanah 1:2, we're told that at the new year, followed 10 days later by Yom Kippur, all mankind passes before the Lord like children of Maron. Well, what does that mean? There's dispute. Okay, so the Talmud comes along and comments on it, and they say, what is this thing like the children of Maron mean? And the dominant explanation in the Talmud is that it means like a flock of sheep. So the Mishnah tells us that, this commentary on the law tells us that what happens at the New Year and Yom Kippur 10 days later is that God judges the world every year, okay, like a flock of sheep passing before him. It's a very interesting image, and I think it's quite possible Jesus was drawing on that in his parable. I mean, I wouldn't, get fired over it or anything like that, but I think that's a good guess. You got to realize so often what we're doing in biblical studies is guesswork, because these are ancient texts written by ancient people, and if we could ask them, we would, but we can't, so we speculate, right? I think here's where it gets a little bit more interesting. The picture is pretty interesting. When you look at the book of Revelation, you have these scenes of final judgment, and they're kind of strange. They have some strange elements to them. I think once you realize that Yom Kippur, by the time of Jesus in the book of Revelation, was actually seen as like hinting at, or like representing judgment, and especially perhaps foreshadowing the final judgment, maybe some of this makes more sense. So look at Revelation 17. John is taken by the Spirit in the Spirit out into the wilderness. One of the 7 archangels says, "Come, I'll show you the judgment of the great whore who's seated on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication." I find that interesting. There's sexual immorality that's going on. "So he carried me away in the Spirit into the wilderness. And I saw a woman sitting on a beast, a scarlet beast." That sounds to me like the scapegoat that was sent out into the wilderness with a scarlet cord bound around it. And remember what they did to the scapegoat? They cursed it and they laid the sins on it. This one is full of blasphemous names. And it had 7 heads and 10 horns. You might say horns like a goat. The woman was clothed in purple and scarlet. She looks a lot like she's been taught by Azazel, doesn't she? She's adorned with gold and jewels and pearls. She's a seductress, right? And you wouldn't be surprised, I don't think, given the background in the story of the Watchers and the giants, these blood-drinking, oppressive giants. Yeah, I don't think you'd be too surprised to know that the woman's got a cup, and the cup has blood in it, right? She is violating every possible norm, right? It's the blood of the saints, the witnesses to Jesus. So it's this interesting picture, and we're told that this whore is judged with fire. Okay, she's finally burnt. So it's pretty interesting, this wilderness, seductress. There's a lot of resonances there with the story of the Watchers and the judgment in Yom Kippur. I think it's suggestive. I'm not the first one to note that. I might be crazy, but I'm not the only one that's crazy, is another way of saying that. We finally get to the second coming image of this last battle in Revelation 19. And I think you see even more Yom Kippur images. We're told that there's a rider on a white horse, and he comes down from heaven. He's called the Word of God. And he's followed by holy ones or saints. And they're all dressed in a certain outfit. Now, you got to know something about the priestly garments in order to get this, I think. Your everyday priest would wear a normal linen tunic. Okay, these are just your everyday guys who are doing stuff outside the temple, okay, in like the courtyards and at the bronze altar and things like that. Your high priest would wear a really fancy garment, okay, with the breastplate with all those jewels in it and the big turban and everything like that. But on the Day of Atonement, when he went into the Holy of Holies, he put on a very simple linen tunic, a little bit different from the one everyday priests would wear. This one was made of super fine linen, white linen, okay? And that's the word that's used to describe how the saints are dressed as they come down with the Word of God in this final judgment scene. They're dressed like priests on Yom Kippur, okay? The first thing we see, I think if you're reading it in terms of Yom Kippur, is you see 2 burnt offerings. The beast and the false prophet that have afflicted the saints are thrown into the lake of fire that burns with sulfur. 2 burnt offerings just like on Yom Kippur. Well, what about the scapegoat? Chapter 20, then I saw an angel coming down from heaven. Remember who dealt with Azazel in First Enoch, an angel. Right? And he had in his hand the key to the bottomless pit, and he had a huge chain. Okay? Very similar to the language that we see in this tradition. Right? And he sees the dragon. Now, we're told earlier in chapter 12 that the dragon is red or scarlet in color. Okay, so remember that. That ancient serpent who's the devil and Satan, and he bound him for 1,000 years and threw him into the pit and locked it and sealed it over him. Now, why don't you just throw the dragon into the lake of fire with the beast and the false prophet? Because we are riffing off of First Enoch here. Okay? So when you read Revelation and you see the dragon at the final judgment, the dragon is bound for 1,000 years, you're like, why is that happening? Well, John is just repeating this tradition. He's just playing off of this tradition. And what seems random, I think, and irrational, actually has a precedent in the tradition of binding this heavenly foe, angelic foe, this rebellious watcher type or angel type, and only finally judging him after a time of imprisonment. Okay. So he takes the dragon, the devil and Satan, he binds him for 1,000 years, he throws him into the pit. And notice the purpose of that, so that he wouldn't deceive the nations anymore. That's exactly what Azazel and Shemihaza are said to do when they come down, is that they mislead the nations by teaching them how to fight and make weapons, seduce one another, all kinds of sin, right? The next thing that we see in Revelation chapter 20 is, I think, a Yom Kippur scene where the books are opened and all of humanity passes before God and they're judged. That's exactly the way that the rabbinic tradition describes Yom Kippur. It says Yom Kippur is a judgment. The books are opened on New Year's Day. 10 days later, the judgment is sealed. Okay, you have time to repent in between. I'm not sure that John has that. But at least that picture of a judgment scene with books being opened in this divine council, I think that's at least going on there in Revelation 20. So I just find it fascinating, I think, how you have 2 Peter, Jude, Revelation, all of them quite clearly drawing on this Enochic tradition, which portrays this kind of initial Yom Kippur judgment at the flood, a model for the final judgment, which is also depicted as Yom Kippur. Let me just draw some conclusions out here. I mean, we've covered most of this material. First conclusion, in the Old Testament and Second Temple literature in the New Testament, when you're reading the flood, you're thinking final judgment. The world would be judged once by flood, once by fire. Second thing is that the flood is pictured in cleansing terms. It's reversing the impurity and corruption brought about by the Watchers' rebellion. I'm not sure you'd get that very easily just reading the biblical text, right? It would be these supplemental traditions in Enoch and the book of Jubilees that would fill that out for you. Third, the flood is part of a nexus of judgment on the giants and the watchers and so forth that includes the binding of the watchers in the earth. So the first thing that happens is the watchers are bound in the earth. The flood later comes and cleans things up even further. Fourth conclusion, Yom Kippur is understood in the Second Temple period as a reenactment of the judgment on the watchers at the flood. Now, I'm not saying that every Second Temple Jew believed that, okay? Just that some did and that we have their writings. That if you ask these guys, what is that Yom Kippur ritual all about? They'd say, well, you're reenacting what happened back in the beginning at the judgment of the watchers, okay? And that's the rationale that they would have given it. And flowing out of that, conclusion 5, the final judgment in the New Testament is portrayed as kind of a fulfillment of Yom Kippur, or eschatological projection of Yom Kippur, which would ultimately cleanse the earth and be the solution to the rebellion of the angels. It makes me think of passages in the New Testament that we tend to ignore because maybe they don't fit into our, theological grids so easily. A passage like 1 John 3:8, which says that the Messiah came in order to destroy the works of the devil. Isn't that an interesting mission statement for Jesus? I doubt if you asked anybody, why did Jesus come into the world, if they would say that first, right? But that's a pretty clear mission statement that 1 John gives. Why did the Messiah come? To destroy the works of the devil. I think as you begin looking at these other traditions, the tradition of the watchers and the corruption that they brought in the book of Genesis and Enoch and Jubilees, you can begin to understand more what might prompt someone like John to say that one of the main thrusts of the Messiah's mission is finally to cleanse the earth of the corruption and impurity brought about by the Watchers' rebellion. All right? Well, thanks for listening.
That was sweet. Yeah, thanks for that. I'm going to spare Daniel any of my own questions because we're going to be prepping a little bit for the Q&A. So we'd like everybody to just take 10, do what you want for 10 minutes, go to the restrooms or whatever, but come back here in 10 minutes and we'll be ready to go.